Thanks. So our next and final speaker for today's session is Stephanie Woerner, research scientist in the Center for Information Systems Research at Sloan. Stephanie is an expert on how companies use technology and data to create more effective business models. She has a passion for measuring hard to assess digital factors and linking them to the future firms and their performance. Imran talked to us about the employee, and next Stephanie will speak to us about how to look at the executive team and the construct by which to enhance their performance. Stephanie, please.
Research on Savvy top management teams. Am I unmuted now?
You're good.
Oh, good. Okay. So today I'm going to share our recent research on digitally savvy top management teams and why it's important for enterprises to really think about who do they have leading their company. As Imran talked, many companies are undergoing a digital business transformation, trying to take advantage of the digital technologies and the opportunities that they allow. But while the digital technologies are important, it's how the enterprise uses them that makes a difference. And our research has shown that leadership teams that can effectively leverage those technologies can thrive. So the financial performance differences between companies with a digitally savvy top management team and those without are stark. Among the larger companies, only 7% had a top management team that was more than half made up of digitally savvy members. And those companies outperformed the rest on growth and valuation by more than 48%. It's imperative in this time for leaders to become savvier and to transform their enterprises. Now is the time to start reinventing your enterprise so that when conditions are better, you and your company are ready to take advantage of opportunities. The Center for Information Systems Research, which is known as CISR, was started in 1974, and our mission is to help large companies succeed in the digital economy. We do research for practitioners and have approximately 90 sponsors and patrons, and we do 8 to 10 projects per year. I invite you to visit our website and explore our research and download it and share it with your colleagues. So, what distinguishes a digitally savvy executive? Last year, we published a provocative article in Sloan Management Review that described how only 24% of boards of large US listed companies were digitally savvy. And those companies outperformed the others by at least 34% on market cap growth, ROA, and revenue growth. And since then, I have to say, every time we've presented that research, everybody asks, so what about the digital savviness of top management teams? So this year, we tried to answer this question. First, we had to start with the definition of a digitally savvy executive. We started by asking executives in MIT CISR events to describe the characteristics of a digitally savvy executive. And then as a team, we did some coding of the executives in companies with digitally savvy boards, and we created a definition. So here we go, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this and if you think we've got it right. So the first is that a digitally savvy executive has an understanding tested by experience on impact, how digital technologies are going to impact the success of the company, and what are the organizational change initiatives that are needed to really address the changes that you're asking the company to participate in. The second one is technologies. Do they know which platforms and which digital technologies are going to best enable the company to enable new business models, to have a better customer experience, to create a more efficient operations, and to reduce cyber risks? The third is enterprise scale. We're looking at large companies, and we think that a digitally savvy executive has to know when to commit, when to experiment, and how to go and create these initiatives that are going to operate at enterprise scale. So it's good to innovate, it's good to have experiments, but at some point you need to scale those experiments, you need to scale all of this enterprise-wide. And then the last is business model and project risk. What part of the technology strategy do you engage with? And we found that digitally savvy top managed executives engaged early. And what do they focus on? So when we looked at these and started to cluster them, we found that digitally savvy executive had a digital awareness and they had enterprise experience. So here's the method that we used for the study. We combined keywords and phrases, as we said. Here's a word cloud of some of the keywords and phrases. We eventually compiled 251 keywords and phrases, and they were associated with the digital savviness, the digital awareness, and the enterprise expertise. And then from the Standard & Poor's Capital IQ Global Market Intelligence platform, we downloaded almost 17,000 executive biographies from larger companies, those with more than $3 billion in revenues, and this sample represented 2021 companies. Then using natural language processing, we keyword coded the bios and classified each executive as digitally savvy or not, based on the bio containing at least one term, one for digital awareness and one for enterprise expertise. So if a executive only had a term or one of the keywords in their bio that suggested digital awareness, but they didn't have something around enterprise expertise, they were not digitally savvy. And then along the way, we also interviewed executives and created in-depth profiles. And here are some of the results. Digital savviness varied widely by role. While 23% of CEOs were digitally savvy, only 12% of CFOs were, and of greater concern was that only 47 and 45% respectively of CTOs and CIOs were digitally savvy. We think that too many of these technology roles were back office or system focused, and these executives often don't have the skill set we believe will be required to outperform in the next decade. Now, in this sample, the 2021 firms represented 86% of the publicly traded US firms and 55% of publicly traded global firms that had over $3 billion in revenue. And so next, I thought it might be fun to do a poll. And I'd love to hear how digitally savvy is your CEO. And you have 5 questions, 5 answers. You can not at all savvy, know something about technology, but not a lot, about average, is actively learning on the job, and finally, one of the best in my experience. So I see that poll responses are coming in. So we have, so it would look here like we have about probably a little bit above average. I would say if I combine the actively learning on the job and one of the best in my experience, that would bring us to 36%, which would be higher than what we found in our study. But think about our audience here. So would say here, it looks like digital savviness of the CEOs is a little bit higher than average in this audience and in this seat. So, and this is really important because the CEO is one of the 6 roles that is that makes a difference to performance. When we looked at firm performance, which would be we've downloaded net profit margin, revenue growth, market valuation, and a host of other financial performance metrics associated with each of these firms. The roles with the highest statistical link to performance when they were filled by a digitally savvy executive were the CEO, the CIO, and the CFO. And in fact, we call these three roles the digital trifecta. These three roles are very, very important. If you can fill your CEO, CIO, and CFO with digitally savvy executives, that is a huge difference in terms of performance. And then we had the chief marketing officer made a difference, corporate communications and investor relations, and then compliance and legal. And some of these sound unusual, but think about what they do. Corporate communications and investor relations is your link to the outside world. Marketing is how you're going to interact with your customers, how you're going to engage your customers. And then finally, compliance and legal. It's an odd one, but we find that in digital transformations and in companies that are really digitally savvy, they take compliance and regulation as just being it's a stake in the ground, and they have to get it right, and they just don't ask questions about it. So and a digitally savvy compliance and legal person is one who knows what has to be done, but also knows and is able to help the top management team figure out ways to transform themselves, to advance, to do creative things without running afoul of the compliance and legal mandates. And we found that having multiple digitally savvy executives across the key roles mattered. Top quartile performing companies on industry adjusted net profit margin and revenue growth were 5.3 times as likely to have that digital trifecta that I talked about, the digitally savvy CEO, CFO, and CIO. So once we looked at the individual roles, we then looked at the top management teams. And to get a broad sense of the impact of digital savviness, we defined a top management team as the company's C-level executives plus the heads of the company's functions in geographic areas. And in this study, a TMT had to have at least 3 executives to be part of the analysis. The average top management team has 9 executives in the sample that we pulled. And here's what the global sample looks like. You can see that there are very few companies that have over half of their top management team being digitally savvy. A great number of the companies have probably only one executive that we coded as being digitally savvy. So you can see it's really striking the level of digital savviness in the top management team. This matches with what we found in the board study. In the board study, only 22%, I believe, of the boards in that study were digitally savvy. Here, it's actually even a little lower, in part because we've expanded the number of executives that we look at, and probably because a lot of the executives are successful based on what they did in the past rather than what they're able to do in the future. And then there were large differences in the digital savviness of the companies across industries. The most digitally savvy top management teams were in information industries. This included media companies, and I believe tech is considered part of information. In these, 30% of the top management team members were digitally savvy, compared to industries like agricultural, forestry, fishing, and hunting, where in our sample we found that none of the top management team members were digitally savvy. And that makes a big difference moving forward in how you're going to succeed in the digital economy. So I thought I would stop here and see if anybody has any questions. Steve, what do you see?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Let me start my video. Thank you for that. We do have some questions, and it's great so far. Some of them are revolving around the board, like you just left off with. What is your research findings about digitally savvy boards? And if the CEO is savvy, but the board is not, would that make a difference?
That does make a difference. So what we're really finding, and we have not now you're talking about the next study, which is going to be, okay, what do you have when you have the digitally savvy board and the digitally savvy CEO? Now, digitally savvy CEOs, CIOs, and CFOs actually have a role in helping the board become more digitally savvy. I think that it is probably easier to have the digitally savvy CEO with a not digitally savvy board, because there's a real opportunity there in developing your board. We found that with board members, there were things to be done like digital tourism. So the top management team can arrange to have the board make visits to companies, maybe in other industries that are digitally savvy, so that they can learn how those companies are doing business. We found that case studies were often very important with board members. And so one of the CIOs that we've talked to, Gary Schulten at Principal, he presents, he'll bring a case study, relying on a problem or an issue that's inside the company to the board, and do a case study with them, and then have them start to deal with the issues. It's really important to have the digitally savvy board, because they're really the backup for the team. They're going to be allocating the money. They're going to be supporting that CEO when there are hard problems to be done. And they're the ones who you want to be thinking about the strategy, and not really. They need to think about the risk. They need to be defensive, but at the same time, they want to give permission to the top management team to figure out what are the opportunities, what is the business model risk, and the cyber risk that can be taken advantage of. So I think that you probably, if you had to have one and not the other, I'd start with the top management team being digitally savvy, and then developing the board.
So going the other direction, if your board or C-suite is not digitally savvy, how can they try to engage with a younger group of employees who are digitally born?
What we've seen there is that now this would be a place for the board. If it looks like your CEO and especially your CEO, because boards, that is one of the most important things that they do, is that they hire and they evaluate the CEO. They may have to decide if there is a change to be made to the CEO. CEOs who want to become more it's really going to be, does the CEO want to become more digitally savvy? And if there is that thirst for change, the CEO is really in good shape. We have talked to companies where it's not been the CEO who's been digitally savvy, but it's been the CIO that's been digitally savvy, and is then able to lead and develop, especially if the top management team has a culture of partnership and collaboration. But there's got to be an appetite for change there. If there is no appetite for change, this is really where a board needs to step in. But if there is an appetite, the CEO can do things like reverse mentoring. We've seen that work, where CEOs will and other top management team members can be paired with a younger employee and they can learn how to do things together. We've seen bringing the younger employees in to, say, present those case studies, say, to a top management team, is an opportunity for the top management team to learn, and it gives an opportunity to the people who have, say, more of an intimate knowledge of how those technologies are going to change the business to really present their case. But I would say there has to be some appetite for change.
Have you seen are firms relying too heavily on the roles of CIO or Chief Digital Officer to augment the TMT digital voice?
I would not. I would put that as a real opportunity, especially when you have a digitally savvy CIO, because the digitally savvy CIO can really begin to show how the strategy can change by using and leveraging digital technologies to transform the organization. So I think the CEO is very important, but I think that if you don't have a CEO, but you have other top management team members like a digitally savvy CMO and a digitally savvy CIO working together, they can balance out. Each company is going to be different, but we've seen many more partnerships come together between the top management team and the between like marketing and digital or information technology, because really what's happening now is that marketing is becoming quite digital.
Right. Maybe two more and I'll let you continue, Stephanie, if that's okay.
Oh, it's fine with me. I'm happy to have the questions.
So one question, I feel that this could be very profound. It says, why are the roles so important if they score so low on the digital transformation, meaning the C-level roles?
They're only important when they're digitally savvy. So that's why they're important, is if they're digitally savvy. If they're not digitally savvy, it's a real impediment to getting your transformation on board. We've done a lot of work, and in fact, I just did a webinar with ILP on the pathways to transformation. And if you don't have a really good top management team that is ready to go and help the company navigate what we call the explosions along the way, it's just not going to work. They're going to founder.
Right. Sort of switching topics here. With regards to industry, the oil and gas industry is about 14% of digital savviness on your slide. And this participant was wondering why this is still the case, since the industry has been making great strides in the past few years. And in general, why is the number still low for a number of these industries?
So that would be, again, where I think that you've got top management team is kind of reflective of past success. And so you've got them, and if you look at oil and gas and some of these heavy extractive industries, they've spent lots of time with their digital technologies on operational efficiency, but they're missing the other part of the equation. They're missing the how do you engage the customer and how do you leverage those kinds of technologies, and how do you innovate there? So those are two things that I think happens, is that you're really pushing hard on the efficiency, and the people that have made it to the top management team and to the boards, because we saw this also with the boards, are those that have come from a different era and they haven't cycled out yet. I think there will be changes.
And it's what's interesting is so if you are requiring your C-level suite executives to have these skills, and I want to ask you follow on, is what are the most important skills that you found? Where's the pool going to be? Are you going to have to draw from perhaps somebody who's more experienced with these skills but doesn't know the industry?
That could be. And in fact, we're doing research right now on, how much does industry matter? And I have to say that that research is very, very early. But it could be that industry is going to matter less, and that because these digital technologies are so important, that you're going to have executives that are going to be able to figure out how they take what's important, what's the base level of importance of the technology, and then transfer it to a different industry.
So with that, do you know, or have you found a group or a gathering of the most important digital skills?
We've started looking at some of those digital skills. And in fact, I'm not going to let you steal my thunder. That's at the very end of the deck.
Perfect. Okay, then you know what I'll do is I'll turn it back over to you, Stephanie.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, so we were curious about which companies with more digitally savvy top management team members were, what were the companies that had digitally savvy top management teams? And we defined the companies. We looked at top performers and digitally savvy top management teams. And when we looked at this, we did both. You had to be in the top quartile on both net margin and on revenue growth, and you had to have more than one digitally savvy top management team member. And if you look at the technology companies, none of them are surprising. I mean, you've got Adobe, Alphabet, Facebook, Microsoft, but there are also a whole group of companies that were non-tech top performers that had digitally savvy top management teams. Companies like Charles Schwab, Marathon Oil, Northrop Grumman, and Dunkin' Brands. But what we're seeing is that the distinction between the tech and the non-tech companies is diminishing. So for instance, to improve its customer experience, Dunkin' Brands rebranded in 2018, and then they invested heavily in their technology infrastructure and their mobile experience. By fiscal year 2019, they had 13.6 million customers enrolled in their DD Perks loyalty program. And in the fourth quarter of 2019, that generated 5% of the company's global sales from mobile, and they generated 13% of all US sales from the mobile order and pay. So this, I think, goes back to Steve's question about, can you bring in, say, some top management team members from other industries, and what will you learn? I think that companies like Dunkin' Brands are showing that you can start to figure out how you really take advantage of those digital technologies in an industry that, providing coffee and donuts, that you would not think of as being definitely technologically savvy. We found that only 7% of the larger companies had a top management team that was made up of more than 50% of digitally savvy members. And this is really important to performance. If you can get to that 50, if you can really start to increase the numbers. These companies had 49% higher growth. They had 16% higher margin, and they had 53% higher company valuation. And that is their share price to sales ratio. But what we did find is that you don't have to achieve a threshold of 50% of top management teams being digitally savvy to benefit. We found that as the percentage of top management team members increase, you get performance increases for both net margin, revenue growth, and valuation. So in our research, companies with one or fewer digitally savvy top management team members grew at 1 percentage point less than the industry average. They grew at, they had a 1.5 price by sales ratio. But if you start to add more top management team members, you'll see that revenue growth goes up and price by sales ratio does go up. And then if you add 4 or more, you get much higher. At that point, the profit margin becomes significant and above industry average, and revenue growth does, as does your price by sales ratio. So really the key here is to start thinking about who on your top management team is digitally savvy. Can you help them develop their digital savviness, or do you need to start adding people that are digitally savvy to really increase and to start to achieve some of those performance increments that we see in our research? So I want to drill down on how executives can develop their digital savviness. Most executives are not born with digital savviness, and they've had to develop their digital savviness on the job. Let's look at the role of CFO, because I think that that's a role that you're not thinking about as being needing to be digitally savvy. And yet it really, at least in our research, can have real impact. A CFO can focus on the financials, the revenues, the earnings, but those measures are lagging indicators and they're difficult to take action on. CFOs can play an important role by focusing on leading indicators and using them to accelerate change. Arno Donkey is the Group Financial Director of Standard Bank Group, headquartered in South Africa and operating in more than 20 countries in Africa and abroad. In 2019, they've made progress in digitizing the group, not just for speed and efficiency, but also for client centricity. For example, in South Africa, 80% of the transactions and inquiries that used to require a branch visit can now be done online. So how did he develop that savviness? So one is he developed a close partnership with the CIO. We have seen this happen in multiple companies. If you do have a digitally savvy CIO, that is a great lever for change. Just by long conversations about what digital can do for your group, thinking, like I said before, partnerships between the CMO and the CIO really help in trying to figure out digital ways of engaging with your customers. Arno also has partnerships with consulting companies and with universities. He's done a lot of work with fintechs. In South Africa, fintechs are a really great threat to the banking industry. And instead of saying that he doesn't want anything to do with them, he's really partnering with them to figure out what it is that they can do better or differently than the bank group can, and then how do you bring those learnings back into the company. They've done digital tourism to visits to digital companies, so Safaricom Alpha in Kenya, Microsoft. This is one way of developing digital savviness that we've seen both in the digital board board research and in this top management team research. He's been involved in industry discussions on CFO of the future and learning, especially from young people in the bank. This goes back to, well, how, is the top management team going to be open to the young people? Can they learn from the young people? Can there be an appetite for change? And Arno has found that the young people are really, really important in terms of accelerating the change within the organization. This ties back to Imran's talk about how do you have the, how do you use your workforce and how do you change your workforce so that they move hand in hand and accelerate that transformation. And then again, Arno has also learned from case studies of digital transformation journeys in adjacent industries. Sometimes we've found that when you want to do a case study, rather than hitting too close to home, some companies have found that it's good to go to an adjacent industry and look at that and then try to find the lessons, pull out the lessons, and apply them to your own industry. He also has a lot of executive partners. Those would be the CEO, the board, the CIO, and business line leaders. One of the things that we've seen in the board research is that a lot of the boards that are more digitally savvy are having not just the CEO come and present to the board or the CFO, but they are bringing in lots of members of the top management team and on a regular basis to present them to the board, because they need to know how the company is changing, how they're transforming, how is business itself changing, how is the environment changing. Boards are not able to just do audit right now. They've really got to be thinking about how do they support the CEO and the top management team as they develop their strategy. So in the research that we did on boards, one metric that we, and it's just one that is around, kind of around business, it's not business as usual, but is having different members of the top management team present regularly to the board, not just once a year. And then he has 3 mechanisms that he found most important for helping him not only himself be digitally savvy, but then transfer that digital savviness to the organization itself. One is he has developed 5 strategic value drivers that they measure to help them keep track of their progress. So these are drivers that are not these lagging indicators, but they're more forward indicators, ones that they have seen really give an indication of whether the company is getting the right things done. They have an enterprise blueprint for change, and they're taking a 360-degree view of the business. And if you look at what Arno says, he says that a new age CFO takes on the traditional roles because you're still going to have to do the financials. You're still going to have to be able to present the results of what has happened in the past. But the new age CFO also focuses on the business impact of data and technology disruption. And he thinks that every business leader, including the CFO, has to be fully aware of how technology can change the market and disrupt the business models. And his definition of being digitally savvy includes challenging business assumptions and predicting and influencing the financial impact of business and technology decisions, understanding the roadmap, and prioritizing investments that are required to be future ready. So the CFO is also going to, because deeply involved in those investments, involved in helping decide which of those investments is the company going to make that's going to help them as they begin to transform themselves. So here's how digitally savvy top management teams make a difference. And this is where I was talking to Steve about some of the things that leaders can do. First, we're going to talk about some of the results that we see that are not just financial results. So we see that digitally savvy top management teams, the top 25% of these digitally savvy top management teams versus the bottom 25%, there's a huge difference in innovation. One of the measures that we use over time, and we've used it in our surveys for the past, easily 15 years, is what percentage of your revenues come from new products and services that have been introduced in the last 3 years. And digitally savvy, the top quartile of savvy top management teams report that 59% of their revenues come from these innovation, these new products and services, whereas you see the bottom 25% only report 18%. Cross-selling is becoming much more important. And in fact, we see a lot of digital transformations that are being made because companies want to increase their cross-selling. They realize that to cross-sell, they've got to consolidate their customer data. They've got to have integrated systems. They have to be thinking about end-to-end processes. And until you can do that, you're going to have a difficult time cross-selling, because cross-selling depends on the customers having a seamless journey across those products that you're trying to cross-sell. So it's a measure that we're starting to see a lot of companies focus on. And in that, the top quartile of top management teams, 53% of their revenues come from cross-selling versus only 15% on top management, digitally savvy top management teams. So those bottom 25%, they really are not taking advantage of that technology to leverage new ways of selling, new ways of engaging with the customers. And then in terms of percent complete on their transformation, when you have a digitally savvy top management team, those companies report that they're almost 70% along on their transformation versus 30% on the top management teams that are in the bottom quartile. These are some of the biggest differences that we've seen in our research across the years that Peter and I have been doing research together. So here are some things that organizations can do to help themselves become digitally savvy. And it's also important for the top management team. So one is rapid learning. And we see that creating a culture of test and learn, of having MVPs, these minimal viable products, sharing lessons, and really talking to one another, collaborating, and sharing best practices, and evidence-based decision-making are really important in helping. They're both a indicator of being a digitally savvy top management team, but they're also going to help executives get there. So it's really important to think about how you're using your data. Are you getting in the habit of creating hypotheses and then doing tests to figure out if those hypotheses are important, and then linking back to enterprise scale, figuring out how to scale the successful tests? Companies that have top management teams that are in the top quartile are modular, open, and agile. They're creating this platform mindset. So a digitally savvy executive, digitally savvy top management team is really thinking about, do they have the platform? Are they creating one best way to do something? And then are they reusing that over and over again, creating these components that can be plugged and played into the platform? And then is that a way also to jumpstart your innovation? And then have you thought about automated decision making, figuring out the kinds of decisions that can be made using the data that you have, and then just doing those decisions automatically so that you're really not thinking about those. Other results that we do see, the use of APIs is really, really important. High savvy top management teams have figured out what their core capabilities are, and they've service enabled them both for internal use and external use. So these top management teams are also thinking about what is it that they can do themselves and what is it that they need to partner on to create, say, really engaging products and solutions for their customers. And then how do you use APIs to get that solution done and that you can present to the customer? Top management teams that were digitally savvy had 66% of their core capabilities were service enabled with APIs, and 57% of these core capabilities were shared externally. So there's a real opportunity for innovation. You can see how all of this is fitting together. Whereas in your low top management teams, they've only service enabled 30% of their core capabilities for internal use, but really only 19% for external use. They're really missing an opportunity for partnering. They're missing an opportunity to bring in capabilities that they themselves don't have, and it's going to be difficult to create those really innovative products and solutions that your customers want. And then finally, in terms of leadership, what are some of the things that you can do? I think one of the most important things that we saw was moving from a command and control orientation to a coach and communicate orientation. We're finding that with these new ways of working, with being more agile, this iterative way of creating products and solutions, this iterative way of working, means that your top management team can't tell people what to do. They have to devolve their authority down. So they're really moving and having to develop this coach and communicate. So communication becomes very important. I would say that that's one of the skills that a digitally savvy executive really needs to develop, is this idea of not just telling people what to do, but really setting a goal and communicating that goal and helping your people get to do their best work. Creating a digital culture is important. We're doing research on that this year also. One of the hardest things to do is holding people accountable. Can you set goals? Can you set performance standards that you want your people to meet and then hold them accountable? But along the way, if you're not coaching them, you're going to fail. And so 25% of top management teams, they do this very well. They're holding their people accountable, and that's helping them proceed along with their transformation. It's helping them change their culture. And then you want to be thinking about innovation. Is it targeted innovation? Are you using your APIs well? Are you moving some of that innovation out to the edge, as I said, where you're partnering? And so these are some of the capabilities that top management teams and that top management executives want to be thinking about developing. So these are actions to take at a firm level. The first is you need to have a frank conversation about who on your top management team is digitally savvy, and how are you going to get them, how are you going to move the people on your top management team, how are you going to get them to become more digitally savvy? And I think when you're talking about a frank conversation, you're going to be looking at, are these people able to change? Or are you going to have to bring new people in? So this is a place where you've got to be thinking about education and knowledge transfer from other savvy executives. This is also a place where younger team members could play a role, because they know a lot about how digital is affecting their lives, is affecting the products that they use, is creating opportunities for them. The second thing is, as it's not just the 50% of your top management team, but also focus on those key roles that we identified. You're going to need the help of the board, especially for the CEO. But I think that looking at getting digitally savvy people into your CIO position, your CMO, your CFO, communications and compliance and legal is really important. You're talking about communicating with external audiences. They want to know that you're doing innovative things, that you're using your technology well. You want to be making sure that you're not overstepping, that you're hewing to regulation, that you've got compliance in place, and that you've got privacy and other security issues covered. So these 6 roles turn out to be the most important, and that would be where you should focus on making sure that you're developing that savviness. And then finally, you want to be thinking about, how do you use both HR and IT together to increase the digital savviness of the top management team? And then from there, you need to move down into the organization. You need to look into, your mid-level organization, and then finally down to your frontline employees. And this is important enough that it should be a senior executive's responsibility. We have had companies that have at times actually either partnered HR and IT together, and we've even seen an instance where you have the executive who is in charge of IT being given HR responsibilities. That was only for a short time, but it's an interesting idea in terms of making sure that you're driving down digital savviness into the organization. You can't do it without HR, but you really do need to have a senior executive have this be their responsibility, building up the digital savviness of the entire organization. Are there any questions?
Yes, Stephanie, there are. Thank you very much for that. Just on your last point there, with regards to HR and IT, when you're trying to hold somebody accountable, it seems as if you combined with the clock speed of technology now, you'd have to have your HR involved long before an annual performance review. Is there some sort of new methodology there?
Yes. Now, we haven't been studying that specifically, but we have been, when we talk to companies about what they're doing, it's part of this coach and communicate role, which is, it's an ongoing conversation about how you're doing, what needs to be changed. Also, the best companies that we've seen do this are doing it on a regular basis. It's not fraught with big, it's just as part of your work, sit down and say, okay, what went well with this, in this last week, what went well, what didn't go well, what could be changed. And you can bring this all the way down to frontline workers. I mean, 7-Eleven Japan started doing this ages ago. They actually gave ordering over to their the clerks that ran the store. And so they would have a coach come in and say, what do you think you're going to order? Why are you going to do that? They would make the order. And then the next week, the coach would come in and say, okay, what were your sales? How did it work? What do you think went wrong? What kind of changes are you going to make? So I think we're asking our leaders to change a lot in terms of developing their people. It's much more around this ongoing iterative process and having them use data to move them along.
Right. If new digital business models represent about 3% of new revenues, a small growth for a company, why is that Savvy TMT makes such a big difference for the rest of the organization?
I think that those revenue, 3% is small. I think it's really 30. On average, we see that new business models contribute, for introduced in the last 3 years, that average is about 30%, not 3%. If I said 3, I'm sorry, it is 30%. So those new business models are really important. And if you look at the top management team, their revenue from new business models was up closer to 60, whereas in the bottom performing was down in the 18%. So companies are trying to figure out, I mean, this is going to help them be more resilient. And I think that I'm looking forward to next year and trying to figure out what is the pandemic going to have to say about this? Because companies right now, I have to say, most of our companies right now are, they're talking about new business models, but they do realize that these are really unusual times. What we encourage them to do is to not just kind of act like your hair is on fire and just cut costs, but instead think carefully about where you're going to cut costs and where you might need to make some additional investments. And then how are you going to use your people?
Have you seen, goes back to perhaps your Japanese example with 7-Eleven, what are the geographical differences in your savviness index? Is there a clear difference between developed and developing nations?
Good question. And I don't have an answer to that yet. I can start to look at it. Now, you're looking at large companies, though, and large companies across the world are in some ways more similar than the mid-sized companies. Mid-sized companies are really interesting, but we focused on large companies. That's who our sponsors and patrons are.
Okay, thank you. And there was one question from the audience, specifically, what do you mean by APIs? Technology APIs, application programming interfaces?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. And so a couple of years ago, we decided that that these were becoming important, and we thought, well, we should start studying them. And over the years, as we've asked our surveys over the past 4 years or so, the percentage of core capabilities that are enabled with APIs has just been increasing. And what I'm not surprised so much about the internal use. What I am surprised about is which of those core capabilities are they opening up to the outside world. And I do know that this is an opportunity for innovation. And so, but it is the technology APIs, the application programming interfaces.
Somebody was questioning one bit of the methodology. It said there might be a bias in the analysis, and you actually just found good top managers. They, being good to start with, also became digitally savvy because they recognize its importance.
There's always a possibility that there is a bias. No argument there. We started with the keywords, and understand that this is what's really surprising is they only needed 2 keywords in their bio to be digitally savvy. So there is a chance that we've really found, it's kind of tautological, but I'm inclined to think not. But I'd be interested in hearing more about that and arguing about it. I think that, the bar was low to be digitally savvy, and there weren't many executives that met that bar. That was what was interesting about it, and how the big difference it made in firm performance. And that was just completely unexpected.
Do you have any information specifically on telecom TMTs?
I have data on telecom. I have, so we have, what we did in this study is we did the machine learning on the bios, and then we have a survey that we just completed. It's a very large survey. And so I have data from the keyword and bios, and then I have telecom data. And I I figured out a variable that links actually companies across the surveys. And so I do have data. I don't have anything right off the top of my head, though.
Yeah. No, well, Stephanie, we're sort of closing in on the final minute here. I thank you. It seems as if you and Imran have some challenges with regards to sort of the feedback mechanism and having a systems dynamics approach between the employees, the boards, the C-suites, and sort of how to systematically implement that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The companies that are really great at this are really getting everybody on board. It's not just driven by a board and or a top management team. The best companies are really thinking about their employees and getting them and figuring out how to leverage their learnings too, because those people are on the front line and they often are closest to the customer so that they know what the customer wants.
Well, Stephanie, thank you very much. And if you're interested in Stephanie's work, we posted a link to her book in the chat.
Thank you so much, Steve.
You're very welcome, Stephanie. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining in today. I understand you each have a respective busy schedule, especially with all the Zoom land now. Please join us for our 3rd installment out of 4 on Thursday, June 11th, for an episode with Sloan Senior Lecturer Michael Davies. And we'll have 10 startups pitching their work in engaging customers and improving profit in the future of work. Thank you very much, and be safe.